The church bells rang, but they couldn't drown out the bride's stifled scream. Emily stood there, her pristine white gown tinged red by the sunset's glow, her trembling hands clutching a photograph that had just slipped from her bouquet. The image showed a young man cradling a baby girl. Her, 28 years ago. That man, now standing at the altar, was her groom. His face froze, his eyes wide with terror as her gaze pierced through him. "No. It's impossible," he whispered, but the truth had already spilled out, sharp as a blade. Welcome to Karma Strikes, where the darkest secrets kneel before justice. Imagine the moment you realize the person you're about to marry isn't just a liar. They're woven into the very fabric of your past. This secret doesn't just shatter love. It tears apart your identity. That's the nightmare Emily faced on her wedding day, when a single photograph unveiled a truth no one dared believe. Who was this man? And how could he stand before her with such a hollow vow? How could a deception this unthinkable take root? And when justice finally struck, how did it bring the betrayer to their knees? This story will grip you, shock you, and remind you. Justice may be slow, but it never forgives. Step into this storm with me. Emily, 28, was a graphic designer living in Seattle, with a smile that could light up a room and a heart that trusted too readily. She grew up in foster care, moving from home to home after losing her mother as a toddler. Her father? She never knew him. All she had was a faded Polaroid of a man holding her as a baby, his face partially obscured by shadow. "Your dad," her foster mom once said, handing her the photo. "That's all your mom left behind." Emily kept it in a small wooden box, a piece of a puzzle she'd long given up solving. Life had taught her to move forward, not dwell on what couldn't be changed. At 26, Emily met David at a charity gala. He was 52, a charming real estate developer with salt and pepper hair and a quiet confidence that drew her in. David was everything she'd dreamed of in a partner: attentive, successful, and endlessly supportive. He'd listen to her ramble about her latest design projects, surprise her with weekend getaways to the coast, and talk about building a future together. "You're my home," he'd say, and Emily believed him. After a year of dating, he proposed on a cliffside overlooking the Pacific, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She said yes without hesitation, her heart full of hope. But there were moments, small, fleeting ones, that made Emily pause. David was private, almost secretive, about his past. He'd brush off questions about his family, saying they were long gone or not worth talking about. His phone was always locked, and he'd take calls in another room. His voice low and guarded. Once, when Emily borrowed his laptop to check her email, she noticed a folder labeled Old Records that he quickly closed before she could ask about it. "Just boring work stuff," he said with a smile, but his eyes lacked the warmth of his words. She pushed the doubts aside. Love, she told herself, was about trust. And David had never given her a real reason to doubt him. Their wedding was planned meticulously, a small but elegant affair in a historic church downtown. Emily poured her heart into every detail: the wildflower centerpieces, the handwritten vows, the playlist of their favorite songs. David seemed just as invested, but there was a distance in him as the day approached. He'd disappear for hours, claiming work emergencies, and return with a distracted look. "Everything okay?" Emily would ask, and he'd pull her close, kissing her forehead. "Perfect now that I'm with you." She wanted to believe him, but the knot in her stomach grew tighter. The night before the wedding, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat on her apartment balcony, the city lights twinkling below, clutching the old Polaroid of her and the mystery man. She didn't know why it felt so heavy in her hands that night, like a warning she couldn't decipher. "Who were you?" she whispered to the photo, tracing the blurred outline of the man's face. The next morning, she tucked it into her bouquet, a quiet tribute to the father she'd never known, hoping it would bring her luck. Little did she know, that photo was about to change everything. As Emily walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on David, who stood waiting with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The ceremony was a whirlwind of joy and nerves, but when they reached the altar, something shifted. David's hands trembled as he took hers, and for a split second, she caught a flicker of fear in his gaze. She chalked it up to nerves. After all, this was their moment, the start of forever. But forever, as Emily would soon learn, was built on a lie so unthinkable it would shatter her world. What would you do if the person you loved most was hiding a secret this big? How would you face a truth that changes everything you thought you knew? That's where Emily's story takes us next, into a moment of discovery so raw and devastating it's hard to imagine coming back from it. Justice, as you'll see, doesn't rush, but it never misses. Stay with me, because the truth is about to come crashing down. The church bells had barely faded when Emily's world began to crack. That photograph, tucked so innocently into her bouquet, had turned her wedding day into a house of mirrors, where every reflection was a lie. She'd seen the man in the Polaroid before, not just in her childhood keepsake, but standing before her, vowing to love her forever. David, her groom, was somehow tied to the father she'd never known. But how and why did his face, in that fleeting moment at the altar, betray a guilt so deep it could swallow them both? Let's rewind to that moment in the church, because what happened next wasn't just a revelation. It was a detonation. Emily, still clutching the photograph, felt her knees buckle as the officiant's voice droned on, oblivious to the storm brewing. David's eyes darted to the floor, to the photo, then back to her, his smile now a brittle mask. "Keep going," he muttered to the officiant, but Emily couldn't. She bent down, her white gown pooling around her, and picked up the Polaroid. The baby was unmistakably her. Those same wide eyes, that tiny birthmark on her cheek. And the man? His jawline, the curve of his nose. It was David, younger, but unmistakable. Her heart pounded so loud it drowned out the organ's final notes. "Who is this?" she whispered, holding the photo up to him. The crowd murmured, sensing something was wrong, but no one could have predicted what came next. David tried to laugh it off, a nervous chuckle that sounded more like a plea. "It's nothing, Em. Just a coincidence. Let's finish this." But his voice cracked, and Emily saw it. The flicker of panic she'd glimpsed in his eyes before. She stepped back, the photo trembling in her hand. "This is me," she said, louder now, her voice cutting through the silence. "And this is you. How is this you?" The officiant paused, confused, and the guests leaned forward, whispers turning to gasps. David reached for her, but she pulled away, her mind racing. Was this a mistake, a cruel joke, or something far worse? The ceremony halted, and Emily demanded answers in the church's quiet antechamber, away from prying eyes. David followed, his charm replaced by a desperate edge. "It's not what you think," he started, but Emily wasn't having it. She thrust the photo at him, her voice shaking with fury and fear. "Explain this, David, now." He hesitated, rubbing his hands together, then let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "I knew your mother," he said finally, his words slow, deliberate. I was around when you were born. That's me in the photo. I didn't know how to tell you." Emily's stomach churned. "Around?" she repeated, her voice rising. You were my mother's friend? Her boyfriend? What? David looked away, his silence louder than any confession. She pressed harder, her nails digging into her palms. Were you my father, David? Is that what this is? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He shook his head, but it wasn't convincing. No, I'm not. I just knew her. I held you once, that's all. I didn't realize until later, when we met, that it was you. His words felt rehearsed, like a script he'd hoped never to recite. But Emily wasn't buying it. Something in his voice, the way it wavered, the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, screamed that there was more. She thought back to the locked phone, the old records folder, the late-night calls. Had he known all along? Had he pursued her, proposed to her, knowing he might be her father? The idea was so grotesque it made her dizzy, but the pieces were falling into place. She remembered a conversation with her foster mom years ago about her mother's older boyfriend who vanished after she was born. Could that have been David? Was he hiding not just a connection, but a blood tie? The twist came when Emily's best friend, Sarah, who'd been watching from the pews, slipped into the antechamber. She'd overheard David's explanation and looked pale, her phone in hand. "Em, you need to see this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah had been helping Emily organize wedding documents and had access to David's email for vendor payments. That morning, she'd noticed an odd message in his inbox, marked urgent, from a private investigator. Sarah opened it now, showing Emily the screen. The email contained a scanned document, a birth certificate, Emily's birth certificate. And under father, David's full name clear as day. Emily's world shattered. The man she'd loved, trusted, and nearly married wasn't just someone who knew her mother. He was her father. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was a violation of everything sacred. He'd known, or at least suspected, and still let her fall in love with him. The room spun as she stared at the screen, the words blurring through her tears. "How could you?" she choked out, turning to David. He opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, the man who'd always had an answer was speechless, caught in a truth he couldn't escape. What would you do if the person you loved turned out to be the one who should have protected you most? How do you process a betrayal that rewrites your very existence? Emily's heart was broken, but her anger was just beginning to burn. She wasn't going to let this end in that church. Karma, as you'll see, was already sharpening its blade, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Stay with me, because Emily's next move will leave you speechless. The storm raging in Emily's heart didn't subside after the horrifying moment in the church. The birth certificate with David's name etched under father was a dagger plunged straight into her core. The man she'd loved, trusted, didn't just betray her love. He hid a repulsive secret. He was her father. But Emily didn't crumble. Tears still stained her cheeks, but her eyes had turned steely, like a warrior gearing up for battle. She wasn't about to let David escape justice's blade. Imagine standing before a truth that makes your entire world collapse. Would you weep, scream, or quietly devise a plan to make the betrayer pay? Emily chose the latter. She knew that for justice to prevail, she needed more than emotions. She needed evidence, strategy, and patience. But time wasn't on her side. David, with that panicked look in the church's antechamber, had already started covering his tracks. He apologized profusely, insisting it was a mistake, and promising to explain everything after the wedding resumed. But Emily was no longer the naive girl who fell for his sweet words. She agreed to return to the ceremony, flashing a strained smile for the crowd. But in her mind, a plan was taking shape. In the days following the wedding, Emily played the part of the perfect newlywed, but every smile, every touch with David was an act. She knew confronting him outright would be risky. David, with his wealth, connections, and charm, could turn the tables. He'd deceived her for 2 years. He could surely fool the world. So, she quietly gathered evidence. First, she reached out to Sarah, who'd found the private investigator's email. Sarah, still reeling from the revelation, agreed to help Emily dig deeper. They started with that email, accessing David's account when he left his laptop open while showering. In the old records folder Emily had once glimpsed, they found a trove of documents, letters, contracts, and a PDF labeled Personal File E. The file contained details about Emily's mother, her birth date, death date, and a brief note. Child. Surrendered to the state. Emily's blood ran hot. David didn't just know her mother. He'd tracked Emily's life from afar, possibly since she was a child. But why? And why had he sought her out, loved her, married her? She needed answers, but she also needed more evidence to ensure David couldn't deny it. She hired a private investigator, ironic, given David's own use of one, and asked him to probe David's past. The investigator, a middle-aged man with eyes sharp as knives, quickly uncovered that David had changed his identity at least once in the 1990s, shortly after Emily's mother died. His old name matched the man mentioned in Emily's foster mom's documents, a young, charismatic businessman who abandoned his pregnant girlfriend to avoid scandal. The twist came when the investigator sent Emily a new report. David wasn't just her father. He controlled a secret trust fund in her name, established right after her birth. The fund, worth millions, was hidden in a Cayman Islands bank, but could only be accessed when Emily married. Suddenly everything clicked. David hadn't stumbled upon her. He'd orchestrated it. The marriage wasn't about love. It was the key to unlocking the trust fund he couldn't touch without her. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a cold, calculated financial scheme, planned long before she entered his life. But Emily's plan wasn't foolproof. David was growing suspicious. He checked her phone more often, asking questions like, "You okay? You seem stressed." Once, she nearly got caught when the investigator texted her at midnight, and David, waking up, glanced at her screen. "Who's that?" he asked, his tone light but sharp. Emily laughed, saying it was a co-worker, but her heart pounded. If David realized she was investigating, he could destroy the evidence, or worse. She overheard him whispering on a late-night call, mentioning papers and handling it soon. He was covering his tracks, and Emily knew she had a narrow window before he acted. She began crafting her revenge. With Sarah and the investigator's help, she contacted a lawyer specializing in financial fraud. The lawyer, a woman with a razor-sharp voice and an unrelenting gaze, confirmed that the trust fund could be used as evidence to sue David for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. But for an airtight case, Emily needed one final piece: David's confession, recorded clearly. She planned a private dinner confrontation where she'd feign partial suspicion without revealing she knew the full truth, luring him into exposing himself. With a recorder hidden in her purse, she rehearsed her tone to mask the rage boiling inside. Would Emily succeed? Or would David, with the cunning that kept his secret hidden for years, uncover her plan? Every step she took was like walking on thin ice, and a single misstep could bring everything crashing down. Justice, as you'll see, was drawing its bow, but the arrow would only hit its mark if the archer stayed steady. What do you think? Does Emily have the strength to face the man who destroyed her world? Stay with me, because the climax is coming and it's going to blow your mind. The air in Emily's dining room was thick with tension, the candlelight flickering like the last moments of David's carefully constructed lie. She'd set the stage perfectly. A quiet dinner, soft music, and a bottle of wine she knew he'd drink too much of. But beneath her calm smile, her heart thundered, and the tiny recorder in her purse hummed silently, ready to capture the truth that would bring him down. This was it. The moment karma would strike, and Emily was determined to make it count. Emily had spent weeks building to this night, her every move calculated to outsmart the man who'd shattered her world. She knew David was suspicious, his questions sharper, his glances heavier. But she also knew his arrogance. He believed he'd covered his tracks, that she was still the trusting girl he'd manipulated. Tonight, she'd use that against him. As they sat across from each other, plates of untouched pasta between them, Emily steered the conversation carefully. "I've been thinking about my mom lately," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "You said you knew her. Can you tell me more?" David's fork paused mid-air, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he recovered with a chuckle. "Not much to tell, Em. Just a brief thing, long time ago." She pressed further, her tone still gentle, like a trap slowly closing. "It's just that photo from the wedding. You holding me as a baby. It's weird, right? Almost like you were family." The word hung heavy, and David's smile faltered. He took a long sip of wine, his fingers tightening around the glass. "You're reading too much into it," he said, but his voice had an edge, like a man standing on a crumbling ledge. Emily leaned in, her eyes locking onto his. "David, if there's something you're not telling me, I deserve to know. We're married now. No secrets, right?" Her words were a baited hook, and she could see him squirming. The tension broke when David snapped, his composure cracking like glass. "Fine. You want the truth?" he said, his voice low and bitter. "I was with your mom, okay? I didn't know she was pregnant until it was too late. She died, and I couldn't deal with a kid. So I left. When I found you years later, I didn't know it was you at first. But then I figured it out, and yeah, I kept quiet. What was I supposed to do? Tell you and ruin everything?" Emily's stomach twisted, but she kept her face neutral, letting the recorder catch every damning word. "So you knew," she said quietly. "You knew you were my father, and you still married me?" David's eyes widened, realizing he'd said too much, but the wine and his ego pushed him further. "It wasn't about that," he spat. "There was money, a trust fund your mom set up. I couldn't touch it unless you were married. I thought we could both benefit. I didn't mean to hurt you." His words were a confession, but they were also a betrayal so vile it made Emily's skin crawl. She wanted to scream, to throw the wine in his face, but she held steady, knowing this was her moment. "You used me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You built our entire marriage on a lie for money." Before David could respond, the doorbell rang, sharp and jarring. Emily had planned this too. She stood, smoothing her dress, and opened the door to reveal her lawyer, Ms. Carter, flanked by 2 police officers. David's face drained of color as Ms. Carter stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room. "David Reynolds, you're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and incestuous misconduct." She held up a tablet displaying the trust fund documents and the birth certificate, now notarized and backed by the investigators' findings. The officers moved toward David, who stumbled back, his chair scraping the floor. "You can't! This is a mistake!" he stammered, but the handcuffs clicked shut, his protests meaningless against the weight of evidence. Emily stood tall, her eyes burning with a mix of pain and triumph. "You thought you'd won," she said, her voice steady now. But karma had other plans. David's smug confidence, the mask he'd worn for years shattered as the officers let him out. The recorder, still running, captured his final desperate plea. "Emily, please, I'm sorry." But she didn't flinch. The man who'd manipulated her life, who'd twisted love into a sick scheme, was finally facing the consequences. The trust fund was frozen, his assets seized, and his reputation, built on lies, was about to crumble in the public eye. The twist came as Ms. Carter handed Emily a sealed envelope from the investigator. Inside was a letter from Emily's mother, written before her death, detailing how David had pressured her to give up the baby and hide the trust fund to protect his career. "He's dangerous," her mother wrote. "If you ever find him, don't trust him." Emily's breath caught, tears welling up not for David, but for the mother she'd never known, who'd tried to protect her even from beyond the grave. That letter was the final nail in David's coffin, ensuring his crimes would be exposed far beyond the courtroom. Have you ever felt the satisfaction of watching a liar's world collapse under the weight of their own deeds? That's what Emily felt as David was taken away. But the cost of her victory was a heart still raw with betrayal. Karma had struck, swift and unyielding. But what comes next for a woman whose life has been rewritten? Stay with me, because Emily's story isn't over, and the aftermath will leave you thinking long after the screen goes dark. The lights in Emily's dining room had gone out, but the storm in her heart still lingered. David, the man who'd once been everything to her, lover, husband, then betrayer, was now led away in handcuffs, leaving behind a void that was both painful and liberating. Her mother's letter, with its warnings about David's danger, was a torch illuminating the past and kindling hope for the future. But justice, though sweet, couldn't erase the scars. After the arrest, David unraveled completely. From his jail cell, he sent Emily letters of apology, each line dripping with belated regret. "I never meant to hurt you," he wrote. "I was swept up in greed and fear." But Emily didn't read them through. She burned the letters, letting the flames consume his final lies. The trial was swift, with undeniable evidence, the recorded confession, the birth certificate, and the trust fund documents. David was sentenced to years in prison for fraud, identity theft, and incestuous misconduct. His reputation as a successful businessman dissolved into ash as headlines screamed about the father who married his daughter for money. Justice had struck, and David, for the first time, had no way out. But for Emily, this victory wasn't pure joy. She moved out of the apartment she'd shared with David, finding a small house near the coast where the sound of waves soothed her painful memories. Her mother's letter became a guiding light, reminding her that despite a past filled with loss, she had the strength to rebuild. She returned to her design work, pouring her heart into new projects, and began attending support groups for trauma survivors. "I lost myself," she shared at one meeting, "but I'm finding my way back, day by day." Emily also took control of the trust fund, not for the money, but to honor her mother. She donated a portion to organizations helping orphans, a way to give back what life had once taken from her. The lesson from Emily's story is crystal clear. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about finding light after darkness. She learned that trust, though betrayed, can be rebuilt with caution and courage. David, in his downfall, was living proof that the seeds you sow today will bloom tomorrow, whether as flowers or thorns. Have you ever wondered what you'd do when faced with a shattering truth? Emily chose to rise, and her journey is a reminder that no one can steal your future unless you let them. And that's how karma struck, proving that no one escapes the wheel of justice. Emily's story isn't just a tragedy, it's a triumph of will and truth. What do you think of her journey? Drop a comment and let me know. What would you do in Emily's shoes? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for Karma Strikes to catch more stories of justice, where the truth always finds its light. See you in the next episode.